A cold January wind swept across Washington on the morning of January 20, 1953, carrying with it a strange tension, something heavier than the winter air, something unspoken yet unmistakable. It rattled against the wrought iron gates of the White House, whispered through the half-frozen branches on Pennsylvania Avenue, and drifted across the ceremonial platforms being prepared for the grand transfer of power. The day was meant to symbolize unity and continuity, the solemn passing of the American torch. But beneath the surface of ritual and pageantry lay a fracture, a quiet rupture between two men who had shared war rooms, exchanged strategies, and together navigated the world's most perilous hours. The cameras would never fully see it. The crowds would never truly feel it. But history would remember. And it began with a door, one that Dwight D. Eisenhower, the victorious Supreme Allied Commander turned President-elect, refused to walk through. This was supposed to be the culmination of a friendship forged under fire. After all, Harry S. Truman had once called Eisenhower the best damn general in the world. Truman had offered him the presidency years earlier, had even admitted that if Ike wanted the Oval Office, he would gladly step aside. But politics had a way of staining camaraderie. Accusations, letters, advisors whispering intentions. Slowly, painfully, the two men who had once depended on each other began drifting toward a collision neither could avoid. The public believed the handover between Truman and Eisenhower would be dignified, respectful, almost ceremonial. And why wouldn't they? America's strength rested on its orderly transitions, its peaceful confidence in leadership change. The world expected unity. But the truth was more complicated. Because on this cold January morning, Eisenhower refused to enter Truman's White House. He would not cross the threshold for the customary pre-inaugural coffee. He would not sit with the man he was replacing. He would not engage in the ritual meant to symbolize harmony. Instead, Truman waited inside while Eisenhower remained in his temporary quarters at the Statler Hotel, preparing for an inauguration overshadowed by resentment. The contradiction defined everything. Two men who led America through the storm of World War II now divided over politics, pride, and the wounds of a campaign that cut too deep. On one side, Truman, the scrappy Missourian, loyal to the institutions he inherited and determined to preserve presidential dignity. On the other, Eisenhower, the towering symbol of American victory, a leader shaped by military discipline, now angered by attacks on his family and convinced Truman had betrayed him. The historical stage was set not merely for a transfer of power, but for a confrontation between competing visions of leadership, civilian versus military, emotion versus restraint, tradition versus personal honor. For years, the United States had leaned on these men to steer it through extremes. World War II, the Berlin airlift, the dawn of the Cold War, and the Korean stalemate. Now, the nation would witness a symbolic breaking point at the very heart of its democracy. As the sun climbed above the Capitol dome, glinting off brass instruments and the polished shoes of marching bands, an invisible question hovered in the winter air. If even heroes can collide, what does it reveal about the fragile machinery of power, and the human pride that turns ceremony into conflict? And so, this is the story of the inauguration snub, a moment often reduced to gossip, but in truth, a turning point that reveals the profound tension between personal honor and public responsibility. It is a story of two men bound by war, separated by politics, and remembered for a single decision on a cold January morning. It begins not with anger but with loyalty. Not with pride but with fear. Not with triumph, but with the quiet sound of a door that one man chose not to open. Documentary voiceover, multi-act narrative. CTI, the build-up. A friendship slowly fractures. Years before the snub became legend, Eisenhower and Truman had worked together with mutual admiration. Their early letters revealed genuine warmth. Truman trusted Eisenhower's judgment. Eisenhower respected Truman's decisiveness. In 1948, Truman even floated the idea that Ike should run for president, either as a Democrat or a Republican. It didn't matter to Truman. He simply believed Eisenhower would be good for the country. But by the time the 1952 election approached, everything had changed. Truman's presidency had been battered by difficulties. A grinding war in Korea. Accusations of communist infiltration. A swelling tide of public dissatisfaction. A divided Democratic Party. Republicans saw an opportunity. And that opportunity was Eisenhower. To Truman, Eisenhower's candidacy felt like personal betrayal, not because Ike ran as a Republican, but because he allowed advisors to attack the Truman administration without publicly defending the president's honor. What wounded Truman most was the infamous incident involving Ike's running mate, Richard Nixon, who implied Truman was soft on communism. Truman expected Eisenhower to rebuke Nixon. Eisenhower remained silent. That silence became the first crack. Letters between the two men grew colder. Staffers began shielding the leaders from one another's comments. The campaign machinery sharpened its knives. By the end of 1952, Truman was convinced Eisenhower had abandoned their wartime bond. Eisenhower, meanwhile, believed Truman's emotions clouded his judgment. ACT-2, The Turning Point, a letter that could not be forgotten. The true breaking moment came late in the campaign. A speech was drafted for Eisenhower suggesting he sympathized with Truman's firing of General Douglas MacArthur, a decision that had split the country in two. Truman believed Ike would publicly support him, bringing closure to a controversy that had defined his presidency. But Eisenhower's advisors warned him. Supporting Truman would cost votes. Remaining silent might hurt Truman's legacy, but it would win the election. Eisenhower chose silence. When Truman discovered the speech draft, never delivered but circulated internally, he considered it a betrayal of wartime loyalty. To Truman, loyalty was absolute. To Eisenhower, politics demanded strategy. Thus the seeds of the inauguration snub were planted. ACT-3, Confrontation, the morning of January 20, 1953. Tradition held that the outgoing and incoming presidents would meet at the White House for coffee, ride together to the Capitol, and conduct the ceremony as partners in patriotism. Records show Truman expected this ritual. He dressed early, pacing the White House floors, checking the time repeatedly. But Eisenhower's schedule was different. He refused to enter the White House. He would go directly to the Capitol. Truman exploded in private. According to aides, he muttered, "If he won't come here, then that's that. To hell with it." Meanwhile, Eisenhower prepared in the Statler Hotel. Advisors noted his calm demeanor, but also his quiet resentment. He believed Truman's earlier behavior during the campaign had been disgraceful, leaving wounds Eisenhower could not ignore. And so, the symbolic scene unfolded. Truman waited by the White House entrance. Eisenhower never arrived. The traditional ride to the Capitol, broken. The joint photograph inside the White House, never taken. A handshake meant for unity, reduced to ceremony on the Capitol steps. Scenes captured by newsreels show Truman smiling, but the stiffness in his jaw betrays his anger. Eisenhower appears formal, distant, offering no warmth. Two men, once allies in the greatest war ever fought, stood side by side with the uneasy silence of a marriage collapsing. ACT-4, Human Element, Voices from the Inside. Fragments from letters and diaries reveal the emotional cost. Truman's aide. The president took it as a personal slight. He felt the general had forgotten who promoted him. Eisenhower's staff member. The general believed dignity required distance. He felt Truman had been unfair in the campaign. Truman's personal diary, January 20th. He did not come. It is better this way. Mamie Eisenhower. I hope this day ends soon. There is too much bitterness. These brief flashes reveal the truth. The snub was not just political, it was deeply human. CTV, Consequences, Aftermath of a Door Unopened. The snub hardened Truman. In later interviews he spoke kindly of Eisenhower's presidency, but never of the man. He avoided White House events with Ike and criticized his military-style administration. Eisenhower, for his part, believed Truman exaggerated the slight. He saw himself as maintaining discipline, not dishonor. But the deeper consequence was symbolic. For the first time in American history, the peaceful transfer of power carried visible tension, revealing that leadership, even at its highest level, is vulnerable to pride, memory, and human pain. Diplomats noted the awkwardness. Newspapers hinted at it but never fully reported it. Historians later uncovered the emotional layers that made the moment so important. CT6, Reflection, the event that reframed power. Though the inauguration snub seemed small, just a missed meeting, a refused entrance, it reshaped how future presidents approached transitions. Ronald Reagan studied it. Barack Obama addressed it. Joe Biden cited it. Each understood a core truth. Ceremony is not about comfort, it is about continuity. And Eisenhower and Truman's conflict became a lesson in humility for all who followed. In the quiet hours after the inauguration, crowds dispersed, after the final bands marched away and the confetti clung to damp sidewalks, the uneasy silence between Truman and Eisenhower became part of the American story, a reminder that power is not merely institutional but deeply human. Looking back, the irony is impossible to ignore. Truman, who valued loyalty above all else, believed Eisenhower's silence during the campaign marked a personal betrayal. Eisenhower, who prized discipline and order, felt Truman's emotional speeches had crossed lines no commander in war would tolerate. The snub, then, was more than a breach of etiquette. It was the culmination of two philosophies, two ways of leading, colliding under the weight of expectation. History often remembers great men for their triumphs. Truman for the Marshall Plan and NATO. Eisenhower for ending the Korean War and guiding the stability of the 1950s. But this moment, the moment one refused to enter the other's house, reveals the uncomfortable truth that even giants stumble when pride takes the reins. The long-term legacy, however, extended far beyond January 1953. Future administrations studied the snub as a cautionary tale. The importance of ensuring unity, the necessity of ritual, the power of a single gesture to shape international perception, all became core principles of presidential transitions. Advisors whispered variations of the same phrase. We cannot repeat Truman and Eisenhower. And yet, the most profound irony is that in their later years both men softened. Truman, retired in Independence, Missouri, spoke respectfully of Eisenhower's achievements. Eisenhower, writing from his Gettysburg farm, acknowledged Truman's difficult presidency. Though they never reconciled publicly, their reflections revealed a quiet understanding. They were both products of their time, men forged by war, responsibility, and the sharp edges of political transformation. The snub did not define them, but it revealed them. And as the decades passed, historians found symbolism in that unopened door. It stood not only for wounded pride but for the fragile architecture of democracy, the delicate balance between personal emotion and public duty. One image from that day lingers above all others. Truman standing by the White House entrance, waiting for a man who would never arrive. Not defeated, not embarrassed, just resolute. And Eisenhower, preparing elsewhere, shoulders squared, determined to begin his presidency without compromising his principles. Two men. Two legacies. One moment that illuminated the human heart behind the machinery of power. In the end, this story, why Eisenhower declined to enter Truman's White House, reminds us that history is shaped as much by emotion as by strategy. The battlefield may forge leaders, but it is the small decisions, the symbolic gestures, the quiet personal conflicts that reveal the true measure of a nation's strength. Because power at its core is not about victory or authority. It is about understanding the weight of one's actions, how even a silent refusal can echo across generations. And so this story leaves us with a final truth. In the great chronicles of civilization, it is not only battles and treaties that shape the world, but the fragile courage required to open a door, or the pride that keeps another man from stepping through it.